Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today at Wisconsin Executive Forums for our expert research. I'm Jim Neidhart, an REF partner in New Jersey in the United States. So over the past few months, we've explored many ideas around the importance of culture, shifting to remote workforces, top talent resigning as they rethink their lifestyles and their careers, and how do all of these changes impact innovation? In today's Expert Insight, we're joined by David Friedman, who will help us to move beyond the theoretical and into action. This is so critical as we reflect on and close out 21, but also as we look to improve our businesses in 2022. David Friedman is the former CEO of a company that won 7 Best Place to Work awards, among many other accolades. He's also the author of 2 books on culture, Fundamentally Different and also Culture by Design. He's the founder and the current CEO of High Performing Culture, the creator of the CultureWise operating system, and an award-winning worldwide speaker. More than anything, David has built a reputation for taking the topics of culture and making it simple, practical, and actionable. I know this for a fact, as David has worked with several of my clients who have implemented his system fully and their companies are totally different than they were before David's work with them. As always, we'll be recording this expert insights for our members, and we'll reserve time at the end for some Q&A. So welcome, David. The platform is all yours.
Well, thank you, Jim. It's great to be with you, and it's great to be with so many members from around the world. So as Jim said, this is going to be a very practical conversation. This is going to be actionable. Yes, culture is important. We know it's important, but we're going to spend most of our time today talking about how do you purposely create the culture that you want. But before we go there, I want to tell you just a brief story of something that happened to me in the past several days, this weekend, actually. So my father is 89 years old, and he lives in a continuing care community, one of these communities where they start with independent living, and then as you need more care, they have assisted living and skilled nursing facility, et cetera. And he lives about a mile from my house, and every Saturday night, I pick him up and bring him to my house for dinner. And this Saturday, I went to pick him up, and when you go there, since the pandemic, they have one of these, it looks like a guard booth, but it's basically, they call it a welcome center. It looks more like a guard booth to me. But anyway, you have to go to this spot, and somebody there is checking to see, well, who are you? Why are you coming, et cetera, proving that it's okay for you to be on the property. So I went to pick him up, and the person that was there was really friendly, and they were helpful, and they, wished me a great day, and they were excited to see me. They're just a really positive experience. So I went, I picked up my father, I brought him back to my house for dinner. And then after dinner, I brought him back, and I have to go through the same thing. Well, it was raining when I was returning him. And where he lives, there's kind of a long walk from where I would normally drop him off to the entrance to the building. And it was raining, and I didn't want him to have to walk through all that rain. And so I at the guard post, I wanted to know if I could drop him off at the front of the building instead of his normal spot. And that front of the building is often locked. So I need to make sure that was open. So if I dropped him off, he could, of course, go in there. So long story short, I said to the person, gee, it's raining. Is the front door open? And this is a new person that was at the spot. And the person's answer to me was, it might be. And I thought, well, that's not overly helpful. It might be. Maybe you could do a little more here. How about calling security and finding out if it's open? And finally they did. And I thought about this experience of the two different people on the same evening. One person who's overly friendly and helpful, and the other person who's doing the minimum necessary. And I thought to myself, is it just luck that we sometimes call a company and get the person who's wonderful, or is that a way that they do business? And I ask that question as you think about your company. If I were a customer of yours and I called somebody in your company, is the experience that I have, is it sometimes just lucky that I happen to get a wonderful person who's incredible and they do fantastic work and have this great attitude? Or is that just the way your company does business? And I will tell you that the single biggest thing that drives whether that's just luck or whether that's the way your company does business is your culture. And we're going to talk about understanding how much impact your culture is. How could we purposely create the kind of culture as we go into next year? How could we purposely, systematically create the kind of culture that would make incredible experiences no matter who I spoke to in your company? So I'm going to share my screen here. So bear with me as I get ready to share this. And I get this up for you. So we're going to be talking about how to leverage your culture as a strategy for growth in 2022. So everybody has seen this quote, I'm sure, at some point. Peter Drucker, the famous management guru, said years ago that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I've actually heard him say lunch also. I don't know which meal he was talking about, but what he was really saying in this quote is that no matter how brilliant your strategy is, no matter how great your products and services are, you're only going so far as your culture will take you. One of my other favorite authors, Patrick Lencioni, many of you have probably read some of his books. And in his book, The Advantage, he talks about why organizational health, as he says, trumps everything else in business. And he talks about the multiplier effect, that he says that basically for whatever given level of product, service, strategy you have, you're going to go 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 times as far with that strategy if you've got a highly functioning group of people who are delivering that strategy, and you're going to go a fraction as far if you've got a dysfunctional group of people. You know, there's a phrase that you hear many times, and you'll hear people say that an organization is only as good as its people. Well, I have a sort of a corollary to that, or a slightly different version of that. And my version of that is I say that an organization is only as good as its people perform, because your people will perform differently in different organizations. In other words, if you think about your staff, if they were to leave your company and go to a different company that's in your industry, a competitor perhaps, I would tell you that they'll perform differently. Maybe better, maybe worse, but it'll be different because they're in a different environment, that the culture that they're in significantly influences everything that happens. It influences how they deliver customer service. It influences your ability to attract people in the first place and your ability to retain them. It influences how they work as teams. It affects their innovation. It affects every single thing that they do. So we know this. Well, if you think about that, you think, well, every organization has a culture. You put human beings together, whether it's your executive forum group, whether it's your company, whether it's a sports team, a classroom, that in every group of people, there's a culture. None of you doesn't have a culture. Whether it's what you want it to be or not, it's a different question, but you can't not have a culture. We all have one. Well, if you think about where that comes from, when you think about even a group of friends of yours has a culture, there's a group of people that you hang out with, there's an unwritten set of rules about how you relate to each other. What kind of activities do you do? Which things is it okay to joke about in that group? All these things exist. Well, if you think about where that comes from, my experience is that in every group of people, there are leaders who emerge. People who just by the nature of their personality tend to exert more influence over the norms of the group than everybody else. I mean, they're the people that in your group of friends, you're trying to decide what time to meet for dinner, and somebody steps up and says, how about we meet at 6 o'clock down the street at that tavern? Well, who is it that said 6 o'clock? It was the leader. Somebody emerges as the leader. And these leaders have more influence over the norms of the group than everybody else. It's just the nature of their personality. Well, the reason that I point this out is I would tell you that absent an intentional force on your part, in other words, if you're not purposely creating the culture that you want in your organization, it's getting created anyway. And it's mostly being influenced by those people who just happen to have the strong personalities. And those people, by the way, aren't necessarily the designated managers and supervisors and leaders in your company. They're just the people with the strong personalities. And if those people happen to be, really positive, enthusiastic, hardworking, quality-oriented kind of people, this will be great. Everything will work out fine. But if some of those people who have strong personalities happen to be cynical jerks, and we've all had some of those jerks in our companies, those cynical jerks with the lousy attitudes, they will influence the people around them to be more like them. And the reason that I point this out is if we understand what an influence our culture has on everything that happens in our organization, that's not something we ought to leave to chance. That's something that we as leaders, we should be as process-oriented about our culture as we are about our sales, our finances, our operations, and every other part of our business. That culture is a business process. It's not just about morale and having pizza parties on Fridays and giving people time off. Culture is a business process, and as leaders, we need to take control over that process and create, drive, and embed the culture we want into every part of our organization. It needs to be systematic and intentional. And I want to show you how to do that. So the way we're going to do that is I'm going to introduce you to a framework, a roadmap, a series of steps that it takes, in my experience, to purposely, systematically create, drive, and embed the culture you want into every part of your organization. And I call this framework, as you can see, the 8-step framework. 8 different things. If we do these 8 things, this is how you pull this off. And while all of the 8 steps are important, my experience also shows me that there are two of these steps that actually have a disproportionate amount of influence over our success. In other words, if we do these two things well, we're going to be 80 or 90% of the way down the road to success. And if we don't do these two things well, we're just not going to get very far. So in the interest of our time in this expert insight that we have, the time we have together to give you the most value, I'm going to do a somewhat cursory review of the 8 steps so that you have the context. And then I want to go back and I want to do a deeper dive on the 2 steps that most drive success for you. So here's how we go. The first step is the most obvious of the steps, and yet it must be our starting point. And it's one of the 2 that we're going to spend some more time on today. And that is that we've got to be able to define with tremendous clarity exactly what we want our culture to be. Now, the reason I say this is obvious is how could we go about building a specific culture if you can't tell me, well, what are you trying to create in the first place? I mean, that sounds kind of obvious. And yet, as obvious as that sounds, my experience is that very few organizations do this well. I'll bet most of you on this call probably have some kind of vision, mission, set of core values you've written. And everybody thinks that's great. And yet my experience is most of the time, those statements don't actually bring the degree of clarity that we need. So I'm going to show you a different way to do this so that we can be really crystal clear about exactly what we want our culture to be. And we can build a whole curriculum around it so that all of our leaders are out there teaching the same thing to everybody in the company. And we begin to create much greater consistency everywhere in the organization. So one of the first things that we're going to do is I'm going to do a deeper dive on this is I'm going to teach you again a new and a different way to define exactly what you want your culture to be without doing the typical vision, mission, value stuff. All right, the second step in our overall framework is one of the simplest things I've ever learned. And at the same time, it's actually one of the most powerful things I've ever learned. I call it creating rituals. Creating rituals, and this is the second that we're going to spend some time on. Creating rituals is all about how do we make things last in our companies? Because we've all had experiences, I'm sure, rolling out new programs and new initiatives, and this is going to be great. And 3 months later, we got really busy and we lost a big customer, got a big customer, whatever. And it all kind of fell by the wayside and became what we sometimes call the flavor of the month. Now, if the only thing that happens in this session today is you pick up a couple of tidbits of ideas and you mess around with them for a few months and you forget about it, I'll be honest with you, it's basically a waste of your time. You guys are too important and my time is too important to waste. So the only way this is valuable is if I can introduce you, as I will, to this simple concept that'll enable you to take what I show you today, what you learn in this session, and still be doing it 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. This has to be sustainable or we're kidding ourselves. And the key to that is this amazingly simple and yet incredibly powerful concept that I call creating rituals. So we're going to go back and do a deeper dive on those 2. All right, the third step in the overall framework, I call it selecting. What I mean by selecting, and as you might guess from the name, is I'm talking about how do you pick the right people to join your company. And when I say the right people in this context, I'm talking about people who are going to be a good fit for the culture that you're trying to create. Now, this is easier said than done. I mean, we know that this is important, and yet it's hard to do. And I will tell you that when people show up to be interviewed or hired by you, I often say they're already fully baked. In other words, they are who they are as people, their value system, how they look at the world. Most of that's already complete by the time they show up at your door. And so the reason I say this is you're not going to have a lot of luck taking people who aren't a good fit in your culture and doing some kind of a magical intervention to convert them into becoming a good fit. It doesn't work. It just doesn't. So we've got to start with people who are already a good fit because we're not going to change the ones that aren't. Now, as I said a moment ago, that sounds great, but it's not easy to do. And I'll be very honest here. No matter how good we get at this, we will never be perfect at hiring the right people. We're going to make mistakes. But I would tell you that there's a big difference between the mistake that we make being, I interviewed this woman and I thought she looked great. I thought she had everything we needed. But it turns out I misjudged it. I didn't read the signs right. I didn't pick up on something I should have seen. That's going to happen. It will. I don't care how good we are. That's going to happen. That, however, is a distinctly different mistake from the mistake being, I knew she wasn't a good fit and we hired her anyway. That's the mistake we have to avoid, and we do it all the time. You've all done it. You've hired people like this. And I'll tell you, the biggest reason I see all the time for this is desperation, especially now. Everywhere I go, we're all struggling to hire anybody. Shoot, who cares if they're a good fit? I just need a body. Sometimes I say it this way. Sometimes it feels like we're comparing a candidate to an empty chair. Compared to an empty chair, that guy looked darn good. But is he really what we were looking for? Not really. And we get tempted to bring these people in. And I will tell you, we will never build the kind of organization we're trying to build, bringing in people who aren't a good fit. It takes a lot of leadership discipline on all of our parts. Again, it's nice to say in the theoretical world, oh, you shouldn't do that. But in the real world, where we're all operating our businesses and we're desperate to find people, it takes an extraordinary amount of leadership discipline to avoid that mistake and to make sure we don't bring anybody into our organization who we don't believe are going to be a good fit. Because we're never going to build the kind of company we want if we do that. That's hard, but important. All right, the fourth step in our overall framework, I call it integration. Integration is my word for what some of you call orientation, or some use the new agey kind of word that I hate, onboarding. I hate that word. It always sounds like waterboarding to me. But whatever words you want to use, it's the word that describes how do you take the people you just hired and how do you bring them into the fold and make them part of the company? The reason that I use this particular word, integration, is I think it has a different connotation. Like orientation suggests I'm telling you about us. I'm orienting you to us. Whereas integration is a word of assimilation. I'm bringing you into the fold. I'm making you a part of who we are. But whatever words you want to use, it doesn't matter. The point is, how you do that process has an enormous influence over your culture. Huge. I often say that if I came to work in any of your companies, I would tell you that the first week that I'm in your company is just about the most important week in my whole career. I mean, this is where I'm figuring out what's the deal around here. How do things really happen? These are my first impressions, and those first impressions are lasting. It's amazing to me how few companies do this well. We spend so much time, effort, and resources in recruiting to get those good people I was just talking about. And then so often we basically throw them to the wolves and say, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions. And we wonder why it didn't work out. If we spent a fraction of the resources that we spent in hiring and we put those back into orchestrating every aspect of a new person's experience, it would have an enormous influence over our culture. Huge opportunity overlooked by most. All right, the fifth step in our overall framework, I call it communicating our culture or making our culture visible. When I talk about making it visible, I mean this in a very literal way. In other words, the signage, the things that I see all around me that tell me what the culture is. Now, this is a place I want to be very careful. I don't want anybody to misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that if we put some beautiful signs on the walls with our vision, mission, and values, that we're somehow going to magically transform our culture. It's not that simple, of course. And we've all seen companies that have those signs and then nobody's doing any of that. So that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is if our culture is authentic, if it's real, actually, the more I see it around me, the better. If the only time I ever see a written form of our culture is on the first day in some of the new hire paperwork, there's an 8.5 by 11 with your vision, mission, and values. And that's the last time I've ever seen anything at all that has to do with our culture. Well, how likely am I thinking about it? How likely are we talking about it? Not very. But if everywhere I look, I'm literally inundated because it is on the walls. It's on an electronic display board in the reception area. It's on screensavers and mouse pads and in the men's room above the urinals and the women's room on the mirrors. And everywhere I look, there's stuff about our culture. There's a lot higher probability we're thinking about it. We're talking about it. I think of it almost like internal advertising. The more I see this stuff around me, the more it's influencing me. And again, I want to be crystal clear here. I'm not suggesting that this is a replacement for everything else we need to do. It isn't. It's just a really simple and yet important element of additional reinforcement to everything else that we're doing. And you're limited only by your own creativity in all the different ways you can do it. All right, the sixth step in our overall framework, I call it coaching. When I talk about coaching, what I'm referring to is how you use the day-to-day situations that come up in your company to teach and reinforce your culture. In other words, you're going to hear me say this a lot. To me, your culture isn't necessarily signs on the walls. It's what your people are doing every day, the way they're actually operating. And every day, you and the other leaders in your organization have opportunities to give people feedback. A customer issue comes up, a vendor issue, an issue between two employees, and they're coming to you to say, what do you think I ought to do? Well, every time in that coaching session, every time you use the specific language and vocabulary of your culture in that coaching, you're pulling it off the wall and you're making it real and relevant for them. Let me give you a really simple example. My company's culture is defined, and you'll learn more about this shortly, but my company's culture is defined in terms of a very specific set of behaviors that we teach. One of them that I'm really passionate about, I call it honor commitments. Do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. Pretty darn important. So let's suppose that you were in my company and we had some situation in which we had failed to do what we promised to do for one of our clients. And I come to you and I say, hey, just like it says right here on the wall, honoring commitments is one of the most important fundamentals in our company. So let's talk about, what do we need to do for this client, this customer of ours, to make sure we've honored every single commitment we made to them? Oh, now I see what you're talking about. See, I could teach the same thing and it could still be an okay lesson, but if I never use the language of honor commitments, I missed a golden opportunity to connect the dots, to have you appreciate that stuff we told you on the first day and the stuff that's on our walls and the stuff that's on our website, that's not just signage. That's how we do things in our company. Every chance, again, that you get to weave that language into the teaching that you're doing, you're making the stuff real and relevant and meaningful for people. Lots of opportunities to do that. All right, the seventh
David,
step.
sorry,
Yes.
I'm going to interrupt you really quickly. We're having an issue with your slides because they're quite small, and we're wondering if you could try and blow those up for us, because we unfortunately can't do it on our end just through the video stream. And it's really relevant, and we already have some questions in the chat that we'll get to at the end of the conversation, but we want to make sure people can follow along.
That's a good question, Carrie, and I honestly don't know, because on my screen, it's taking the entire screen, so it's as big as it can be.
Okay. Maybe if you get out of the
Want me to get out of screen share?
for 1 second, and if we can go into the PowerPoint again, I think it might just be the way that it's being shared.
All right, let's just take a quick look. Let's see. It could be. Bear with me a moment. Sorry about that. Does it still look small?
Not seeing anything yet.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'm just trying to see if there's a way of changing that mode.
If you can't do it, that's fine. We'll move along anyways, but we just wanted to see if it was a quick fix.
Yeah, darn it. Sorry about that. I just want to check one other spot and see if I can change that. Yeah, it says it's in full screen.
All right.
So sorry about that. I apologize.
No worries. We'll keep moving along. And these will be, I think we can share some of these slides with the
Yes, I can give you the slides so that when you send out the recording, you can send them all.
And also, if everyone who's watching, you can go into full screen as well. That helps.
No, sorry about that. Okay. So the seventh step in the overall framework, I call it lead by example. It's something
you have to share, though. Sorry, David, you're still not sharing your slide.
All right, we'll get this right. And Am I sharing now? Can you see it now?
Yes, thank you, David.
All right, there we go. So the seventh step in our overall framework is leading by example. It's something I'm sure everybody on this call knows, that what you do tells people far more than anything else about what's really important. We could talk about this stuff forever, but at the end of the day, what you and the other leaders in your organization do will tell people more than anything about what the culture really is. The eighth and last step in the overall framework, then I'll go back and do a deeper dive on the two things that I said will drive success the most. The eighth step is all about how we create accountability for our culture. In other words, how are we showing ourselves, our people, the world, that we're not kidding, we're actually serious about this? Because if there's no accountability for it, it's just a hope. A lot of different ways we can do that. For example, elements of your culture should be built into your performance review system. If I was sitting with my manager and I'm going through a performance review and nowhere in the conversation is there any discussion about our culture, well, what conclusion would I come to other than it's not important? Or here's another example of accountability. This is something I do in my company, that my company's culture, I mentioned, is defined in terms of a very specific set of behaviors that we teach and practice. We do an annual survey where we write a description for each of our behaviors, and then we ask people, in your observation of working with us on each one of these specific behaviors, do we almost always, usually, sometimes, seldom, or never do this? And every year we survey all of our customers, all of our vendors and suppliers, and all of our own employees. And we convert the almost always, usually, sometimes, seldom, or never to a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 scale. And we can now actually put a number on how well we live to our culture in the eyes of those who interact with us. But ultimately, I'll tell you, the biggest element of showing accountability is your willingness to let go of somebody who is not a good fit. Virtually every company I've ever worked with has at least one person, I'm sure you all have, who is a pain in the neck. They're opposite of everything you say is important. You keep talking about them in your management meetings over and over again, and they're still here. My experience is a large percentage of them tend to be salespeople. So they're not all, but a large number of them. The classic salesperson who's a pain in the neck, again, opposite of everything we say is important, but man, they bring in a lot of business, or they have some of our most important customer relationships, and we're reluctant to let go of them. And when we don't let go of those people, we're basically sending a loud, clear message to the whole organization, aren't we? We're telling people, you know, folks, I want you to understand our culture is really important. Unless you produce enough business, is what we're basically saying. I sometimes say it this way. Sometimes the best way for me to really know the culture of your organization is to look at the behavior that you tolerate. Think about the people that you've allowed to stick around. You're basically telling your company that's okay. You know, my experience is whenever I'm working with CEO groups and I ask them, how many of you have ever fired one of those people? Almost everybody has at some point in their career. And I ask them, what did everybody else say when you did? And practically in unison, they say, I should have done this a long time ago. Thank you for finally doing this. And that's the clearest you'll ever be, that we're not kidding. We're actually serious about this. So this is the big picture. So now that we've got the big picture, let's go back and do a deeper dive on the two things that I said really drive success the most. And the first of those is how we define exactly what we want our culture to be. Now, to do that, I want to introduce you. This is sort of my funny slide of how many companies try to define their culture. Is they do somewhat of a, I'll call it a silly exercise that looks like this. So we're not going to do that. We're going to do this in a more substantive way. So to do this, I want to draw a very important language distinction for you. And it's more than just semantics. It's a distinction between what I call values and what I call behaviors. So let me explain to you what the difference is between the two and why this is actually really important. So a value to me is typically an abstract concept. So examples of values are things like integrity, quality, respect, innovation, teamwork, loyalty, service, commitment. These are ideas, concepts. A behavior, in contrast, is an action. It's something that I can literally see people doing. So some of the behaviors I teach in my own company are things like honor commitments. That's something you actually do. Practice blameless problem solving. Be a fanatic about response time. Get clear on expectations. These are actions, things that people do. Now, the reason that this is important, and not just a question of semantics, is that the problem with many companies, not all, but many companies' traditional looking set of core values is that they tend to be so abstract that they mean too many different things to different people, and they therefore become very difficult to operationalize in any meaningful kind of way. So let me give you a simple example. One of the core values that I find in many organizations' lists of core values, and it's listed here, is the value for respect. We should all respect each other. And that sounds like a perfectly good thing. I mean, especially these days, who could argue with that? But what does that word mean? It means a lot of different things to different people. If you grew up in an inner city gang, your definition of what it looks like to respect somebody, or perhaps to diss them, to disrespect them, could be completely different than what it might mean in your family. Or I think about, regional differences. In the southern part of the United States, in an area that we sometimes call the Bible Belt, people are raised there as children, and they're taught that when you speak to an adult, you call them sir or ma'am. It's disrespectful not to do that. Do that in the northeast part of the United States where I live, that's just weird. It has nothing to do with respect at all. In some parts of the world, if I look you straight in the eye when I speak to you, that's called being respectful. In other parts of the world, that's very disrespectful. Depends on where we are. So to simply say one of our core values is respect sounds great, but I don't know that it's all that useful because it means too many different things to different people. Behaviors, again, are much easier to teach and coach and guide and give people feedback about. It is extraordinarily difficult to coach somebody about their values. That's hard to do. But I could coach them all day long about the behaviors that I see them doing because they're action-oriented. This is what I see them doing, and this is what I want to see differently. Like just as you think about defining your culture, so I say that you define your culture in terms of not necessarily those broad nebulous values, but rather in terms of the behaviors that you say, if we could get our people to do these, we're going to be that much more successful. So some tips for you in thinking of, so if you want to define your culture in terms of behaviors, how would you think of them? So a couple of quick tips. First of all, there are things that you always say as leaders, if we could just get our people to do this more consistently, we would be even more successful than we've ever been. What are some of those things? What are things that drive you crazy? Every one of us as leaders has things that when we see them, we think, oh my God, that drives me nuts. What's the opposite of that? If your people weren't doing that thing that drives you crazy, what would they be doing instead? That's probably pretty good behavior. What are things that if you're the CEO that you rant on, if you're not, that your CEO rants about? If there goes Bob or there goes Mary, she's on her rant again. Well, you wouldn't rant about it if it wasn't important. That's why you're ranting about it. That's probably pretty important. Here's one of my favorite questions. Typically, in every department of our company, we usually have one or more people who we wish we could clone. The people you say, boy, if I could get 3 more women like her, we'd be amazing. Well, what does she do? Picture that person. What does that person do that makes you want to say that? Well, I mean, they do this and this and that. Those are probably pretty good list of behaviors. Sometimes picturing real people, your best people, makes it easier to think of behaviors versus it just being an abstract idea in your brain. So we want to be able to define exactly those behaviors. So here's an example. This is actually a client of ours, a CPA firm in Florida. And this is a list of their behaviors. It's on their website. And so each behavior has a title and then has a description. So one of the ones I referred to before, practice blameless problem solving. And the description might say something like this, for those that might not be able to read it. It says, demonstrate a relentless solution focus rather than pointing fingers or dwelling on problems. Identify lessons learned and use those lessons to improve ourselves and our processes so we don't make the same mistake twice. Get smarter with every mistake and learn from every experience. So notice how much more clarity that brings to what you want people to do versus just the typical respect, service, quality, integrity. So a behavior brings a lot more clarity. Typically, what we normally do is we create what we call the company's way. It's the ABC company's way. This is the way we do business in our company. And we print a little card. So this is my own company and our behaviors that we teach. And they're all written out. Every one of them has a title and a description. So once again, notice the clarity that this brings to this is what we want our culture to be. I want people to be doing these things, and I can teach and coach them. So now that we've got more clarity about what we want our culture to be, we still have to be able to get our people to do it. It's not just about clarity. It's how do we get our people to internalize these behaviors? And we do that through this concept that I referred to earlier that I call creating rituals. So a ritual is some behavior and practice that you do over and over and over again until it becomes ingrained. It just becomes second nature. The reason that rituals are so important is that most people are not very good at sticking with things. This little cartoon here depicts in January, every gym is mobbed because everybody sets their New Year's resolutions. This is the year I'm going to get healthy. And then by February, they're back to their normal levels of activity because we're not very good at making things last. When something becomes a ritual, it's not difficult to do. So simple examples of rituals in the United States, every time you go to a ball game, we kick off the ball game. We start the ball game by singing the national anthem. When you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth. You don't struggle to remember to do it. It's not a debate in your mind. I don't know if I really want to do it today. It's just a routine. Some people before a meal, they say a prayer. They're just routines. So the reason that rituals or routines or habits, as another word, are so important again, is that most people struggle with sticking with things. Once something becomes a habit or a routine or a ritual, though, it's not difficult to do. It just becomes what we do. So the concept here is if we could create rituals that become automatic as brushing our teeth, if we could create rituals around teaching and practicing the behaviors that we were writing, now we've got a chance for this to last for years and years into the future because its continuity would no longer be dependent upon you being disciplined or motivated. It's not you that's going to keep it going. It's the ritual that keeps it going. It just becomes automatic. So let me give you a simple example of this that I learned years ago that really influenced my thinking. So everybody's probably familiar with the Ritz-Carlton hotel chain. Ritz-Carlton is known for extraordinary service, but it isn't by accident. They have a series of behaviors and they have rituals. Their behaviors are called their basics. There are 20 behaviors that Ritz-Carlton teaches. They have them on a little laminated card and they're numbered 1 through 20. And they're things like this. Number 12 says, to provide the finest personal service for our guests, each employee is responsible for identifying and recording individual guest preferences. If you see somebody that has a problem at Ritz-Carlton, you own it, and it's your job to take care of it. If you see somebody who asks you for directions, you don't just point, you bring them to where to go. These are basics. So these 20 basics that they teach. But more important than that is this ritual they have. At Ritz-Carlton, they have a ritual, and it's called the daily lineup. What happens is every single day, in every Ritz-Carlton property in the world, in every department and in every shift, the team members get together at the beginning of the shift. And they gather around and have this brief meeting. It's about 10 or 12 minutes. And the first thing they do in that brief meeting is they spend a couple of minutes talking about the basic of the day. So remember I said there's 20 of these. If this were a Ritz-Carlton property where I am today, and we happen to be on day number 1, all day long in every department, every shift, the team members would be getting together at the beginning of the shift. They'd gather around and they'd kick off their meeting talking about basic number 1. Tomorrow, all through the property, everybody gets together and they talk about basic number 2. And the day after that, 3 and 4 and 5 and so on. At the end of 20 days, they go back to the beginning and they do it over and over and over and over again every day of their entire career. So think about this. And by the way, if today's day number 11, it's day number 11 in every Ritz-Carlton property in the world today. They've got roughly 40,000 employees on 5 continents and 35 or 40 different countries. And today, every single one of their 40,000 employees is in a daily lineup, and every one of them is talking about the same basic. That's the real concept. I learned about that many years ago, and I took those ideas and created a very similar thing. I call my behaviors fundamentals. So they call theirs basics. I call mine fundamentals because they're fundamental to success. So we created these set of fundamentals, and then I practice them on a weekly basis. And most of our clients do it weekly. So where Ritz-Carlton goes through them on a daily basis and every 20 days goes back to the beginning, I do a weekly ritual. So every week we have one fundamental and we focus on it all week through a variety of different rituals, several of them. One of those rituals is that every time we have a meeting in my company this week, the first agenda item of the meeting is the fundamental of the week. And we spend the first 3 to 5 minutes talking about it. What does it mean? How do we practice it? What can we do better about it? So every meeting, everywhere in the company this week, even a virtual meeting, every single meeting all week long starts with this week's fundamental. And then we move on with the rest of the meeting. Next week, every meeting starts with fundamental number 2, and the week after that, 3 and 4, and so on. When we get to the end of the list, we go back to the beginning and we do it over and over and over and over again, because that's how it sinks in. There's also a mobile app that we use these days. But I want to sort of simplify, to kind of wrap this up in a nice bow for you, to simplify this concept into one really simple illustration. If you want to learn anything so totally, so completely that you've internalized it, whether we're talking about you want to learn to be a great piano player, or you want to learn to speak another language fluently, or anything that you want to get great at, what do you have to do to get great at something? You have to practice and practice and practice and practice. You have to do tremendous amounts of repetition. But here's the problem. Most people hate repetition. We get bored. Oh, I don't want to keep practicing. And so things fall by the wayside. Well, the only way to keep repetition going is when it becomes a habit or a ritual or a routine, whatever word you want to use. So the rituals are the platform or the structure that enable repetition to keep going, and the repetition is what's necessary to internalize something. So let's apply this thought very directly to driving your culture in 2022. If you want your people, if driving a culture in your company ultimately, really, if you cut to the chase, is nothing fancier or more complicated than getting your people to live and internalize the behaviors that drive success. That's all it is. You know what you want them to do. We just want them to internalize it. Well, they're not going to internalize those behaviors because you held a big company meeting and you announced it to them all. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do that, but that's not going to be enough. They're not going to internalize those behaviors because, you put it in their performance reviews, though I still think that's a good idea. They're not going to internalize those behaviors because you put posters all over your walls. The only way they're going to internalize those behaviors is when you teach it to them over and over and over and over and over and over again. And the only way you'll ever teach it to them with that much repetition without getting bored, distracted, and quitting is when you create rituals around it. That's why rituals are so foundational to success. So I'll wrap this up and then we'll answer some questions with one quote that kind of, for me, capsulizes everything we've been talking about. It's my favorite quote on the topic of culture. And the quote says that good companies have good cultures by chance, but world-class companies have world-class cultures by design. And what I mean by that quote is when I say that good companies have good cultures by chance, what I'm suggesting is if you are a good leader, and I'll bet virtually everybody on this webinar is a good leader. If you're a good leader, you're going to do most of the right things. You're going to hire good people, not because it's a big strategy, but what else are you going to do? You attract people like you. And you're going to treat them reasonably well, not because you read a book one day that said you should treat your people well. What else would you do? You're a good person. You're going to treat your people well. And if you do that, you will have a good culture. What we've been talking about in this session is not the difference between success and failure. I mean, honestly, how could I claim it is? Most of you on this call probably have been very successful and you haven't been doing what I'm talking about. So this isn't the difference between succeeding and failing. This is the difference between succeeding and being extraordinary, because that's a different game. That while good companies have good cultures by chance, the best companies understand just how important their culture is to success, and they don't leave any of this to chance. Instead, they're incredibly intentional and purposeful and systematic about every aspect of how they create their culture. And the key to that is define exactly the culture that you want to have through behaviors, and then create rituals to practice them over and over and over and over and over and over again. And that's the simplest way to do it. So that's a pretty brief overview, but that should give you some real takeaways that you can do something with. I'm going to get out of screen sharing and we can take some questions from you. So.
Hi, yeah, I'm back, popping back in. Yeah.
Good.
So we do have a few questions that were in the chat, and people, you guys can all start adding in the comment section, additional questions that you might have for David as well. The first question we have comes from Veronica, and she kind of takes us back to the beginning. So we've talked about how do we change our culture and how do we get people with rituals to kind of adapt to the behaviors that we want to be seeing. And she has asked the question, how do we ensure people that we hire fit with our culture? So let's imagine that we do have a culture that we like. And is there something that we can start looking at for, I know a lot of people have gone through a lot of change this past year. We've seen people leave companies. And so people, as we're looking to keep good habits and get rid of old, ones that weren't working for us in the past and incorporate that into our hiring process. Do you have any kind of tips or recommendations?
Yes, for sure. It's a great question. So the first thing is, and it's why I keep coming back to this idea of why the first step is defining with enough clarity exactly what we want our culture to be. We can't possibly hire people, or we can't be very effective at attracting and recruiting people who are going to be a good fit if I don't know what a good fit is. So that's why everything starts with, well, what is it that we're trying to create? So once we've created that list of behaviors that I call fundamentals, what we can then do is begin to write interview questions around those fundamentals so that we're choosing people who those resonate with. As we're looking at our fundamentals, those behaviors, what you'll tend to find is that you can broadly divide them into two categories. Some of them are what I would call intrinsic. Either you have this in you or you don't. Some of them are what I would call learned. So for example, practicing blameless problem solving, I would call a learned behavior. You don't come out of the womb as a blamer. Maybe you learn that in your experiences. So I can teach people how to do that differently. But some things are very intrinsic. Either you are this way or not. And I got to find people who are that way. So you could take your behaviors, divide them into intrinsic and learn. And then for the intrinsic ones, we could write interview questions around them. When we're writing interview questions, we want to, of course, write interview questions that ask about, for examples and stories. So I don't want to ask, do you think quality is important? I want to ask questions and stories. Give me an example of when. We also want to ask questions, ideally, that don't necessarily project or telegraph exactly what we're looking for. So let me give you a simple example. Let's suppose that we wanted somebody who was really team-oriented, because that's the way our company runs. I might ask a question like, so Carrie Ann, tell me about, in your last job, tell me about a project you worked on that you really were proud of. What happened? Now, I didn't ask anything about teams. If the story you choose to tell me is, I had this job where it was the first time that I didn't have to depend on anybody else. I was in total control from beginning to end, and it was just great. You might be a wonderful person, but you're probably not very team-oriented. If the story you choose to tell me is, I was on this is great. We're on this project, and I got a chance to work with people from all different departments of our company. And some of them I'd never even met before, and I got perspectives that I never would have imagined. It was so much fun. Well, you're probably more of a team person. Now, again, I didn't ask, so do you like working on teams? I'm asking for a story. So we want to take our intrinsic behaviors and then write good interview questions that get people to talk about what's really important to them so that I can see, is this inside of them or not? That's the best thing we can do.
Excellent. We have our next question comes from Byron. So how long does all of this take, David, to create a world-class culture in your experience? What have you seen companies kind of go through in terms of change management of all of that?
Yeah, in my experience, it is, Byron, it's faster than people think. So this idea that, it takes years to change, not my experience. And I'll give you some specifics on this, but just to give you context, The process that I teach, I myself and my company have implemented in more than 400 companies. So that's a pretty good database of experience. So I'm not saying, oh, one time it happened this way. I'm gonna have 400 companies worth. So first thing I would say is the process of implement, I'm gonna separate how long does it take to implement something like this, and then how long does it take to actually see some impact? So in order to implement, having done this as many times as I have, it can be implemented in as fast as 30 to 60 days. So this is not something that's a year or two long process of meetings and meetings. I know we've got this down to a science. This is not hard to do. It's very logical. It's very practical. And within 60 days, a company can be up and running, practicing fundamentals every week. Now, once they're up and running, how long does it take to actually see some results from this? What I see is there are two things that happen very rapidly. The first thing that happens is that right after it gets rolled out and introduced into the organization, people start using the language of the fundamentals. And this is a really important thing. One of the most powerful aspects of this is creating a common language. When we all are using the same phrases, the same meaning, it changes the game. So the first day after it's rolled out, you'll hear people even jokingly say, hey, remember that was fundamental number 3. And even if they're joking about it, that's okay. It's starting to sink in. It's seeping into their brains. The second thing that happens within the first couple of days after rolling this out is people begin to respond to situations in ways that are different today than they would have been a week ago. And here's a classic example of it. So one of the fundamentals I mentioned that's in my company and pretty much all of our clients, and I showed it up on the screen, even if you couldn't see it very well, was called practice blameless problem solving. It's such a powerful fundamental. And so you'll see somebody right after it gets rolled out, and the next day, some issue will come up with a customer, and a team of employees will get together and they'll say, okay, folks, remember, we got to practice blameless problem solving now. And they'll start treating that situation differently from how they might have just the week before. And then it just builds from there. So we typically see pretty significant changes pretty rapidly. So, the idea that, oh, this is a long, slow process and it takes years, not my experience. It doesn't.
Yeah, great. So we've got just a few minutes left. I wanted to ask you one last question here, which is, what have you seen CEOs, leaders of companies really struggle with as they start looking at 2022? Just everything that's happened in 2021. What have you really seen them start struggling with? Are any of these roadblocks? Where have you seen regression on any of this? And how are they what would your recommendation be on if we do see our culture moving away from what we want it to look like, and we do have a clear vision for how we want to move forward in 2022? Any recommendations around just, the struggles and pitfalls of making these kinds of changes?
Yeah, it's a good question. What I would say is probably the single biggest struggle that I see and hear from employers is companies who have had a good culture, have made it a priority. Maybe they haven't been as systematic, but it's been important to them, and they're pretty passionate about their culture, and they're worried about, how do I preserve that culture in this changing times? And there are two things that cause them to worry about it, at least. One is having so many people working remotely. So when we were all together, we had this nice family feel and everybody kind of picked up the culture. And now that we don't see each other, I'm worried as a leader about, how do I preserve that? The second thing I hear is that as companies are growing and we're adding new people, it's a different company than it was a year ago or 2 years ago as we're growing, assuming we're growing. And so the whole mix of people, we used to have many people who had been in our company for 10 or 15 years. Now we got all these new people. The new people don't know our culture. How do we make sure that it doesn't get lost or diluted as we grow? And what I would say to you is, the answer to those challenges comes back to why I said earlier that it's so important for us to be systematic, to have a methodology, to see culture as a business process. When companies are smaller, to a degree, they could get away with, and some of you that are on this call, maybe this describes your situation. When you were smaller, you didn't have to talk about culture so much. I mean, you only had 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 people. And if you're the leader, people saw you every day, they were around you, and they could pick up the vibe from your example. Be like you. And, you connected with people all the time. But as a company grows and it goes from 10 or 15 or 20 people to 50 or 100 or 200 or 500, or maybe we make an acquisition or two, or we open up an office in another city, or a pandemic forces our people to work remotely, all of a sudden our people aren't seeing us every day. And if the primary driver of our culture was physical proximity, our ability to be together, that's how we drove our culture, and there was nothing more systematic, then we're at serious risk in this new world. And that's why it becomes even more important than it's ever been to see culture as a business process, that there's a system, there's a methodology for how we drive our culture. It's not just, oh, we have a ping pong table in the reception area and we try to every once in a while do a community event. That's not driving culture. That's just playing around on the edges. We should be, as leaders, we should be as process oriented about our culture as we are about our sales, our finances, our operations, and every other important part of our company. And in fact, I would make the point that if there was anything you could do in 2022, I mean, beyond 2020, at any time, if there was, as a leader, if there's any lever you could pull that would touch on more aspects of your company, I don't think there's anything that touches more parts of your company than your culture, because it does affect your ability to get those people you want and to keep the people. It affects, as we said earlier, it affects how productive they are, how committed they are, how much they go the extra mile, how they treat your customers, how they work together. It affects everything. So there's probably nothing you could do that would have more impact than working on that and working on seeing it as a business process.
I think it's so interesting, everything you just talked about as we're planning for 2022. We're at time, but there's one question I think kind of piggybacks off of that, and that I've heard a lot from our various different CEOs and leaders, and that has to do with incorporating the company culture across different generations. So Lucia has just given us so things that you're talking about, processes, and how do you incorporate that across the different generations, Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z? Have you seen that kind of taking a process-oriented approach help with that as well? Because I know that as people are, remote work and Gen Z and Gen Y, it's a great question, I think.
So what I would say is that the basic methodology is the same. There are some tools that we might use that are different. So the methodology is still in any group of people, whether that group of people is your company, your kids, the students in a classroom, the athletes that you're coaching on a team. If you want to get a group of human beings, I don't care how old they are, to perform in a consistent way, we have to define really clearly what we want them to do. And we have to create a structured, systematic way to teach those things to them over and over and over and over and over and over again so they sink in. So that concept is the same across all humanity. What's different is just what tools might we use? So with a younger generation, we might use Slack and mobile apps and Teams and other tools. With an older generation, there might be more face-to-face things, or there might be other mechanisms we use. So it's just it's a toolkit question of which tools do we use that will work best, but don't let that distract you from the methodology. The methodology is about human behavior. If we want a group of humans to behave in a consistent way, we have to be clear about what we want, and we have to have a structured, systematic way to keep teaching it over and over and over again with enough repetition for it to become internalized. Then it's just a toolkit question.
Great. Thank you, David, so much for your time. We've got to run, unfortunately, because I think we could sit here and talk about this for ages. David's given us his contact information. As always, we'll be providing a recording of today's session, and we will get out a PDF with the slides from David to all of our attendees today.
Erin, if I could mention one last thing for you as we wrap up for your members. I do a lot of talks, and I know that one of the challenges people face, whether it's a webinar or a live talk, is you hear good ideas and then you go back to your company and it's hard to know how to communicate that to others. So I actually have a video that I created a few years ago. It's a 12-minute video, and it starts by saying a senior leader in your company heard some good ideas and they don't know how to explain it. Let me explain the concepts to you. And in 11 minutes, I explain the entire concept in a way that really helps a leadership team to get it. And so it's been a useful tool to maybe have your leadership team watch it together. And then as a team, you could talk about, all right, so what do you think of this? What do we do with any of this? So if you would like that, my email was on the thing before, but Carol put it out as well. It's david@culturewise.com. If you send me an email and say, I'd like to get the 12-minute video, I will send you a link to that 12-minute video. But it's been really useful to share with your leadership teams.
Thanks, David. That's great. We'll make sure to get that out to people. We just popped David's email into the chat here right now, and we will also put it up with the recording. Thanks for being with us today, David, and thanks
You're
to all of
welcome.
our attendees. We'll see you in the next Expert Insight. Bye, everyone.